Hello, and welcome to the Coach Right podcast, where we explore how to turn coaching expertise into published pages. I'm your host, Helen O'Neill, portfolio career specialist, accredited future of work coach, author and creator of Coach Right 90, the writing programme specifically designed for coaches. You can get the episode show notes and your free guide to publishing options at coachright.co.uk. It's time for the next chapter. Welcome to the Coach Right podcast. Helen here, recording on Saturday the 28th of February 2026, and this is episode 16. My guest today is Katharine St John-Brooks. We're going to be talking all about her book, Internal Coaching. We had an absolute blast recording this episode and cover everything from co-writing to second editions to writing spaces in trendy parts of London and even fiction. There's been a lot going on in the last couple of weeks, but before we get into that, a quick thank you to everyone who reached out to congratulate me on the 500 downloads milestone. It means a lot that you're on this journey with me, and I'm looking forward to bringing you more episodes in the months to come. In coaching news, we've seen the launch of the fourth version of the Global Code of Ethics. Now, no matter what kind of coach you are, who you're accredited with, this is the code that underpins everything we do. The update has been developed to be more relatable for practitioners, representing coaching, mentoring and supervision more equally. The intention was to respond to the emerging needs and developments within our profession and be more firmly anchored in shared professional values. It's also been designed to be globally inclusive, recognising cultural diversity and different professional contexts. So that's the official line, but what does that actually mean? Well, reading through it, you can imagine one of the most notable updates was with regard to technology and the requirement of members to respect ethical approaches to coaching, which, and I quote, include the use of data technologies and AI. Now, obviously, we've all been talking an awful lot about AI. We do that on this show pretty much every time I record. But this is important because we've almost become so attuned to talking about the AI bit, we've sometimes forgotten that we operate in a space where we need to be very mindful about data security, data management, and data respect. These things are absolutely essential, so I'm really pleased to see them pulled out. The code reminds us to take all ethical dilemmas to supervision, but calls out those related to AI too. Supervision itself is elevated from being considered to be good practice to being an active ethical checkpoint. There's been some additions with regard to the policy adherent, with regard to climate change, for example. Also, having a plan for continuity of service if a practitioner becomes unable to complete their work for some reason. This is really important to think about because there are so many new independent coaches offering services as part of the solo business. We're often not thinking about that continuity aspect. So it'll be interesting to see how that consideration plays out in real life. From an inclusivity perspective, the code specifically calls out the need to monitor our communication for bias and stresses that the language of the code itself has been made more accessible. Now, there's an awful lot of what in the ethics and not a lot about how. It's worth remembering that this is a guidance document and is neither measured nor mandatory. But that said, I think these additions are really important. And as practitioners, returning to what's important in terms of ethics is something that we need to do on a regular basis. Language has almost been a bit of a theme these last couple of weeks. Rebecca Rushman shared the Vive Le Coaching AI in Coaching glossary over the last fortnight. Now, this is aimed at addressing the fact that we're all using lots of different words to talk about AI, and it's starting to get confusing. System manufacturers have been saying for quite some time that their tools are AI generated, when in fact they're basically just a set of predefined steps in a workflow. Now people are saying they've got AI agents when actually they're just grouping their prompts in one place. AI agents are automated, a bit like a self-driving car. And does it matter? Well, I do tend to agree that yes, it does. In coaching, for example, we have the coach bots, which range from glorified web chat through to a tool that's been built specifically to know all of the AI models and have data-led conversations with the end user. It doesn't take a massive leap to connect that back to the ethics point we were talking about just a minute ago. Raises some questions though, doesn't it? How do we use AI in coaching in a way that is ethical? Should we? Do we? Personally, I still can't quite grasp how to create a psychologically safe space and have AI in the coaching room. So I'm continuing to keep those two things very separate right now. I do think, though, that there is a huge benefit and opportunity for training new coaches using these kind of tools. And it's also probably worth saying that AI can be a good, if not better, coach than many of us. Yet it will always be replicating being human. And regardless of how good it presents to be, there just simply will not be a human-to-human connection. I'm sure this isn't going to be the last time we talk about this. And AI has been in the news in publishing as well. Romance novelist Carol Hart has come out publicly to say that she's produced and published over 200 novels in the last year using a variety of AI tools to generate the words. She had various pen names, and none of the titles specifically were breakout successes, but collectively they have made her a six-figure author. She estimates she can generate a decent book about once a day. Again, it is worth noting that while we might like to think that all of the content created by AI is slop, we are seeing this because there is still an awful lot of lazy editors out there who are literally copying and pasting content from an AI model onto social platforms or into their books. This isn't an AI capability issue. It's an end user issue, and Carol has clearly overcome that problem. She has taken the time to learn and has produced content that is acceptable to the reader. And this is really important to note because romance is nearly always first with innovation in publishing. For those of us that write, we have a choice. We can, like Carol, get really good at creating volume content using the tools available, or we can spend time crafting something that's slower and that connects more on a human-to-human level with the reader. Rapid release is not new. The difference is the models available, the volume. And personally, I like writing, and so I'm just going to keep doing it myself. Which leads very neatly to an update about the resilience book. So a few weeks back, I spoke about getting stuck in the messy middle of the structural edit, but I am pleased to say that I have now reached the 2/3 mark and I'm starting to feel the ramp up of energy to get the final bits done of this stage of editing. I have about 6 weeks ahead of me where I'm pretty clear of any client design work required, so I'm going to put my head down and see if I can get it done. I've been tinkering with the Coach White website as well. I really wanted it to represent the services that are available to meet clients where they are and create a new welcome sequence for people who've been signing up for Coach White Reflections. I was very strict about setting myself a 2-week deadline to get all of the work done. The last thing I needed to do was to fall down the rabbit hole that is WordPress. But I am very pleased to say that it is much easier to navigate and everything's much easier to find. If you're not signed up to Coach White Reflections already, please do come along. It's completely free. It's a weekly email where you get lots of insight into personal development and writing. And you'll always be the first to know of new services, but I do tend to avoid being too overly salesy because, quite frankly, I can't bear that. But anyway, you can pop along to coachwrite.co.uk/blog and you'll see the form where you can pop your email address in. Anyway, enough from me. Let's get on to the interview with Katharine. It's time for the next chapter. Welcome to the Coach Right podcast. My guest today is Katharine St John-Brooks. With over 20 years' experience as a leadership coach, the second edition of Katharine's book, Internal Coaching, The Inside Story, was published by Routledge in November 2025. Welcome to the show, Katharine.
Hi, lovely to be here.
So, if you can start by telling us more about you and your path to publication.
Yeah, well, I've had sort of 4 different careers in a way before I got to this point. But I had 20 years, first of all, as a civil servant. And I took voluntary redundancy from there in 1996, and they were doing a clear out of 25% of their senior civil servants in every department. And so I took the opportunity then to jump out and became, well, it was eventually a management consultant, but basically I was doing anything that anybody would pay me my daily rate to do at the beginning. And then I realised that actually most of the things I was doing did fall under the broad heading of management consultancy. So there were things like, I don't know, restructuring, sort of doing a report on restructuring the senior management team at the Office of Fair Trading, I remember was one of my first ones. And as a former civil servant, it was very much in my ballpark. But I got to the point where I was beginning to feel a bit guilty about calling myself a management consultant, which I had begun to do after about 3 or 4 years, when I didn't have an MBA and I'd never worked for any of the big consultancies. And so I thought, I don't want to do an MBA because of the financial bit, which I wasn't very interested in and was never going to be doing any kind of financial consulting. So I did a master's at Birkbeck in organisational behaviour, which was absolutely lovely. And I'm only really mentioning it because my experience of doing the interviews for the masters for the research was something that very much ended up in my training to be a coach. Because what happened was that I was doing sort of semi-structured interviews, the way you do, and they were supposed to last an hour, and I'd got my questions and so on. And I was interviewing senior civil servants about their sort of learning and development and so on. And they kept diving off into how they were miserable and how they were getting on incredibly badly with their boss and this, that, and the other. And I was rather wanting to follow them down these sort of holes, but I needed to get back to my semi-structured interview questions. So it was all rather frustrating. Would have loved to have, followed those sorts of things up with them. And then about, I don't know, a couple of months later, when I was still doing the write-up for my research, I had lunch with a former client who said that she was training to be a coach with INSEAD. And I was completely unsighted on coaching. And so obviously asked her what that involved and what it meant. And I suddenly realised that it would permit me to have those sorts of conversations with people that I was having to deny myself when I was doing my master's research. I instantly did some digging to see where I could get trained. And this was 2003. So there wasn't much training around, actually. There was Miles Downey, there was CIPD, and there was what was then called the Oxford School of Coaching and Mentoring, which is now OCM. And I actually did, I mean, there must have been something else around, but those are the only 3 that seemed to be very obvious in 2003. So I decided to do the CIPD one because it was based in London, and it was actually delivered by what is now OCM. And I absolutely loved it. And as soon as I'd qualified, I'd been consulting for about 7 years by that point. So I emailed everybody who I'd ever done any work for and said, and I'll train as a coach, ... And I was incredibly lucky because I happened to hit a wave of coaching becoming very popular in the civil service. So I was both a former senior civil servant and I was a coach. And it was just a lovely era. I was just terribly lucky with my timing. And I joined the EMCC instantly, and I've been a sort of EMCC groupie ever since. I really loved them, always went to their conferences, met loads of lovely people. began to be interested as a member of the EMCC in ethics and the code of ethics. So when, after I'd been coaching for 5 or 6 years, I realised I sort of reached a plateau and felt that I needed to sort of do some more proper personal development and professional development, I decided to do a coaching master's. So at that point, well, exactly. Yes. Well, I mean, we are sort of continuous learners as coaches.
Such a coachy thing to do, isn't it? It's like,
isn't it?
I haven't done a course for a while. I should probably do some professional development. Yeah.
No, it becomes addictive, really, doesn't it? So I can't remember why I hit on the Professional Development Foundation, which is David Lane's outfit. You know, David Lane founded it and has run it for, I think it's their 25th year anniversary this year, actually. Anyway, but they do lots of masters and doctorates in coaching. And I decided to do it with them. And David was my research supervisor. And I was particularly interested because I was interested in ethical dilemmas, and I'd been on the EMCC's ethics committee and had just got generally interested in the whole subject. I became aware that internal coaches had a much more complicated time when it came to ethical dilemmas than external coaches do, because of all the intertwining relationships, because they're part of the same system as their clients. So I decided to do my research into the ethical dilemmas that can arise for internal coaches, and also the support offered to internal coaches. That was the sort of second arm of the research, because it felt to me that if they were going to be able to deal with ethical dilemmas well, then they needed support such as CPD and supervision, particularly supervision, which I'm a massive advocate for. So I did the research, and David was my research supervisor. And when I finished it and finished the masters, he said, "Did you know that I'm editor for a coaching series for Carnac Books?" I said, "Are you?" I had absolutely no idea. And he said, "Well, yes, and would you turn your research into a book?" So at that point, I mean, the research, as I say, it had 2 arms. It was around ethical dilemmas. And that research was absolutely fascinating, because, of course, internal coaches certainly did encounter loads of ethical dilemmas. And so I remember we established a sort of top 10 varieties of ethical dilemmas that were particularly prevalent. And then there was the support. But I realised that if I was going to write a book on internal coaching, I needed to do a hell of a lot more research, because what I wanted to do really was to cover the whole ground from cradle to grave, if you like. So starting with the strategy, why would someone set up an internal coaching pool within their organisation in the first place? Because, as you all know, internal coaches are employees of organisations who are formally trained to be coaches, but they coach other people within their organisation, rather than my own experience as an external coach, going into an organisation, coaching, and then coming out again. So I realised that, if it was going to be useful, A, to internal coaches themselves, or B, to organisations thinking of setting up an internal coaching pool, I really needed to take them through the whole process. From the strategy, the why, what kind of people do you select, how do you actually decide who to select to train as an internal coach? How do you source the training, what level of training, all the sort of infrastructure stuff that organisations have to set up in order to make sure that the whole thing runs effectively, like policies of one kind or another, educating line managers about what coaching is all about, so that if they release someone to be trained as a coach, they realise what the implications are. And similarly, if they have someone in their team who needs a coach, that they understand what coaching is all about. So there was all that. There was all the support side of it, how to provide CPD, how to source supervision, pros and cons of internal or external supervisors for your coaches. And then, of course, one of the things that's most important to me is evaluation, because my antennae wave in a worried way if I'm talking to someone who runs an internal coaching pool and they're not doing any kind of evaluation of whether it's effective or not. Because you only need a new finance director to come in and say, we seem to be spending some money every year on this internal coaching, so what does it do?
Where's the ROI?
Absolutely. And if you don't have any kind of evidence of outcomes, of how it's useful, then you're absolutely up the creek when somebody asks you to justify your budget,
Yeah, for sure.
So it seems to me just so short-sighted not to do evaluation. So it's a fat chapter, the evaluation one, because it sounds boring, but it doesn't need to be boring at all. None of these things do. Once you get into the weeds, it's actually fascinating, all of it.
No.
So anyway, but that's how the book began, was David asking me to write it. Although I still, of course, it was Carnac Books then, who were bought, I think, in 2019 by Routledge. So they're now Routledge. But Carnac at the time, I had to write a proposal and so on. So it's not as if David saying, will you write it? Meant, it was all, after that was it. I just wrote it. So I did do the proposal and so on. And, I think that the proposals are actually quite interesting documents, and I've listened to a few of your podcasts. I'm not sure if anybody's yet talked about the proposal stage of it, because I think the more thought that goes into the proposal, the better, because they often ask you things like, they sort of, how does it fit into the market? And they expect you to know the market pretty well in terms of what's been written on the sort of topic or related topics to the one that you're going to write about, so that publisher can see that there is a gap there that you're seeking to fill, and you're not duplicating something that's on the market already. I think that one of the things that took me aback as well, I can't remember whether it was in the proposal for the first edition or the second, but for one of them, definitely for the second one, I needed to suggest 3 or 4 people in the sort of who were big people in the field, as it were, for them, the publisher, to send my proposal to them and for them to say, yes, I agree with this. It is a gap in the market, or this is a book that needs to be written. And it's obviously well worth thinking ahead as to who you might invite for that.
It's a really, really important point, Katharine, because it's funny how many coaches I speak to that have written some sort of academic paper, either for a master's or for a PhD, or have done research, like primary research, and are looking for a way to turn that into a book, which, as you say, is not quite as simple as somebody saying you should turn this into a book. There is a stage ahead of that if you want to go down the traditional published route.
Yes.
And obviously Routledge is being an academic publisher in the traditional space. And again, I'm also mindful that the market has changed dramatically from when you would have submitted your first proposal to when you did the second edition of the book. So what are your observations in what's evolved during that time?
Well, there's so much more tech in it now. Dealing with Routledge this time round compared with Carnac first time round, it's just completely different, because now they expect the author to do so much more than one needed to do 12 years earlier. So things like any figures in the book need to be described. So you have to sort of do a kind of spreadsheet with all the different figures, and then I can't remember how many words it was, but a short description of what the figure is for use in the ebook, I think it is. Yeah, it will be the ebook. There was, in terms of when we actually needed to submit the book, I just submitted a Word document to Carnac and that was it.
Yeah.
Whereas this time round, they had a portal.
Oh.
A portal that you had to submit each chapter into separately, and the beginning bit separate, the sort of, they call
the front matter.
Front matter, thank you. The front matter and the end matter all had to be done, each as a separate document. And I am pleased to say, because it would have absolutely done my head in, but my wonderful co-author, Julia Duncan, her husband is pretty techie. And they did the whole of the submitting process.
Yeah.
And it was a nightmare. It took them 2.5 hours to begin with, only not to have managed it, because in the sense that the system kept throwing things back, saying, sorry, there's something wrong with this one, without explaining what. Oh. And so I remember her telephoning me and saying, we spent 2.5 hours on it and we've just exhausted and we're going to bed. And it's just luckily, it was the day before the copy deadline, although I do know now that actually publishers don't apparently really expect you to meet the deadline. But anyway, I've always met deadlines, so I assumed
Let's not advise anyone of that.
No, let's not. No, let's not. I've talked to other authors who say say, oh, I'm already 3 months late, sounding very cavalier about it. I thought, blimey, really? But basically, they went back to it the following day, managed to do it. But that technical aspect of submission was a real thing. There is a lot more that I think in the past that the publisher did, which now the author needs to do. Lots of spreadsheets about, yes, figures, illustrations, tables, all sorts of stuff have to be put in, done in a special way and so on. It's been technically quite challenging, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I'm very mindful that we have almost glossed over the fact that you've been through this process twice. So obviously, a lot of people will be thinking, I aspire to write a book. And you write the book and you're like, brilliant, tick, I've written my book and now I can get on with my life. And we'll come on to other writing aspirations that you have in a moment, because I think people are going to be very interested. But before we do, how did you come to be asked to do a second edition? What sort of happened there?
Well, it was just, I can't remember whether it was a conversation with David Lane or with Routledge, probably David, actually. Just, the general idea was that the book was still selling, but it was over 10 years old. Mm-hmm. So it was getting long in the tooth. And I think we were all very aware of how much had changed in between. So I did have to do a formal... So David said, yeah, I think definitely, but you'll need to do a formal proposal for Routledge, which I did. And they, immediately said yes. So that was great. I didn't have to sort of jump through many hoops happily, which was great. But I must say that the process of writing the first and the second ones was quite different.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So with the first one, because I knew I wanted to do a sort of cradle to grave, how to set up and then evaluate it, your coaching pool, it was the structure of the chapters was quite straightforward. The only bit that was different was that, or not completely cradle to grave, was that I decided I did want it to be a two-part book, with the first part very much aimed at internal coaches themselves. So either people who were already internal coaches or people who were thinking about training to become an internal coach. So it was really all about being an internal coach. And given, of course, that I have never been internal coach myself, it was a research interest rather than something that had been part of my own practice. My approach, as it were, was, as it is, just because being a natural extrovert, is just to talk to people, talk to as many internal coaches as I could think of. And obviously, as I'd done for my master's, my research had involved nearly 150 internal coaches. So I had quite a few people to go back to talk about the other aspects of setting up a pool and the pros and the cons. Did they have a strategy? Didn't they have a strategy? I mean, it's so interesting how many organisations actually don't have a strategy. They have an enthusiast in the learning development department who is trained to be a coach, and thinks it's absolutely wonderful, as indeed it is, manages to scrape together some money from somewhere and trains a dozen coaches, let's say, without really going through the process of, why are we doing this? What's the problem we're trying to address? Who is it within the organisation we think would be particularly benefit from coaching? How does this fit in with our people strategy? How does this fit in with our organisational strategy? It's simply a nice to have. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to offer coaching as part of our menu of, opportunities that we can offer to our employees? And goodness knows I'm not knocking that, because obviously it is a wonderful thing to add onto one's development interventions. But actually, how much better would it be if you'd really done the thinking as to, why we're doing it and how we can... Because actually, without doing the why, it's very difficult to evaluate, because if you don't know why you're doing it, then it's difficult to say whether you've actually achieved it or not. Yeah. You can monitor and say, we've done X coaching hours in the past year and Y number of clients or whatever. But that's not really about outcomes. That's simply about how much of it is going on, not whether it's being effective, But basically what I did, so I just talked to billions of people. I'd had 20 years as a civil servant, so writing notes of meetings was meat and drink to me. So I then had just reams and reams of notes and so on. And in terms of the process, I basically just had 10 fun chapters, 10 folders, and threw anything that was relevant to the particular chapter into the folder. And I did that for about a year, I should think. And it included obviously reading academic articles. I mean, I just finished my master's. I was still stuck in the sort of academic groove. And David, of course, is very rigorous when it comes to research. So while we did have a bit of a sort of conversation around that, because I wanted it to be very accessible, you know, the first bit directed at the coaches, the second part of the book directed at people in L&D thinking of setting up a coaching pool. And I wanted it to be really accessible. And he said, well, yeah, you can make it accessible as you like, but it's still got to be academically rigorous, and you still need references at the back of the book and so on, which was fine. And that's what we did. What I did first time round. So the process, yes, really was just a year of just reading, talking, listening, and then the folders getting bigger. But one thing I did really hit was something which I understand a lot of writers is an issue, which is when do you stop researching and when do you start writing?
Yes, it's the secret question.
You always want to do a little bit more. Talk to yet another person who'd mentioned that they, knew someone in internal coaching who they put me in touch with, and I could talk to them about their practice and so on. So it was always very tempting to carry on. So thank God for deadlines.
Yes.
Because obviously when I'd signed the contract with Carnac, I'd had to say when I planned to deliver it by. But we got to, I think it was January. So my deadline was the 30th of June, whenever it was, 2013 it would have been, a long time ago now. And in January, I still hadn't started writing it. And I was getting really desperate because I found it just incredibly hard, or in fact, impossible to start it at home. I don't know what it was, but I just could not make that jump to starting to write. And I remember feeling absolutely desperate about it. And I was having coffee with friends, and she said, we've got a flat in Covent Garden that my niece has been living in, and she's just left, and it's going to be empty for the next month. And we're just off to Chile. Here are the keys. If you want to just go there and write.
Oh, fabulous.
What a fantastic offer.
Yes, because that beats a coffee shop any day.
Brilliant. And it also felt like a very groovy part of town to be based in for a while. So I did basically 3 days. I was still coaching and so on, but I worked it out so that I had 3 days a week when I could go to the Covent Garden flat and just write. I didn't quite manage to leave my mobile phone behind, but I did manage to have a sort of coffee time. I allowed myself to look at it for 10 minutes. Lunchtime, I allowed myself to look at it for half an hour. Tea time for 10 minutes. And then, because it was the whole distractions bit that was the problem. I'm easily distracted.
Aren't we?
Well, indeed. And honestly, if it hadn't been for that, I don't think I ever would have got started. Because once I got into the groove, then I was for the second edition, I have been able to do it from home, but for the first edition, I still couldn't do it at home. So I was a member of a club where I coached people in Northumberland Avenue. It's called the Royal Overseas Club, I think. Anyway, seems such a long time ago now. But I had to go there. I just basically had to be away from home in order to be able to write. But as you say, it's the equivalent of the coffee shop, isn't it?
Yeah, I always think have a writing place. I mean, it's a room of one's own, isn't it, fundamentally? So if it's good enough for Virginia Woolf, it's good enough for me. But it is about place, just separating and going, this is where the muse will turn up. This desk, at this place, at this time, every day, they will be there. I will get the words down. And it's amazing how that works for everybody.
Brilliant, isn't it? I do remember talking to someone at the time when I was sort of at my wit's end, and he said, they've got off-street parking, and he said, I used to just go and sit in my car with my laptop and do it there. And that was his room of his own, was sitting in the passenger seat of his car. Why not? It's just, you just have to sort of isolate yourself, basically.
People write their books on their mobile phones with their thumbs on their commute these days, don't they? whatever works for you to get the words on the page. I think that's wonderful. Although I must admit, if I had a choice, a flat in Covent Garden, was it Covent Garden or Camden? Began with a C. Somewhere very trendy in London. Sounds amazing.
It was absolutely wonderful. So for the second edition, the process was quite different, because when that one came up, I thought, I'm not sure I've got the energy to write a second edition. So I was thinking really, really hard about, actually, can I do this? Because for the first one, I just finished my master's. I was still stuck in that kind of world. I was in my early 60s, whereas the second one, I was in my early 70s. I had lots of other things I was doing. I was still coaching. It was all together. Oh, yeah. Well, actually, I wasn't still coaching. I was, we'll get on to it anyway. I was stuck into fiction by then. So it was quite difficult to decide whether to do it or not. And then I had a brainwave, which was, why don't I get myself a co-author who can help me deliver it? And I was terribly lucky, because Julia, who trains internal coaches and supervises internal coaches and is also a coach herself, had used my book, the first edition of the book, for 10 years as a sort of textbook for her training courses.
Oh, fantastic.
She knew the book backwards.
Perfect.
So she was the obvious person to ask. And brilliantly, she said yes. There was a lovely other aspect to it, which is she lives in France, in the most glorious part of France. The actual town's called Beaulieu, beautiful place. And indeed it is. And so we had a brilliant weekend quite early on in our collaboration, where we were chunking through the entire book and deciding what to keep, what to add, what to cut, and so on, in her brilliant garden in the sun in June 2024. Oh. It was just glorious. But the process was different. Partly, the structure was there, because, we were updating something. We decided quite early on we wanted a whole new chapter, which Julia led on, lots of new sections. And we needed to do lots more research, because a lot had changed in 10 years. And we actually put together a questionnaire, which we sent to people we knew in internal coaching. And wonderfully, 137 internal coaches responded to it. Oh, and some of the questions were around, what would you like to see in a second edition?
Oh, brilliant.
Really great. And we were also asking them stuff around supervision, where things have really moved on, which is marvellous. Many more internal coaches receive supervision than they did over a decade ago, which is great. Because there still are organisations with this awful double standard, where they expect their external coaches to have supervision, and might even go so far as to ask them to provide evidence from their supervisor of how many sessions they have a year. And, there are some organisations that do that, and yet have internal coaches that they don't provide they don't provide supervision for. How crazy is that? Absolutely. But mostly they're doing their best to provide supervision nowadays. So it was good to get a bit of updated research on that. And obviously there were loads more articles on internal coaching that have come out in the last 10 years. Academic articles. So that was another part of the research that we needed to do. And I think I worked out it was over 200 Zooms I had over a 9-month period of talking to internal coaches, seeing, how the landscape asking them how the landscape changed. And then if they said something interesting about their practice, I'd say, would you be interested in our putting together a little case study on that? Or could you give me a couple of paragraphs about what you did there and what worked and what didn't, or whatever? And I was so lucky, because, coaches are such wonderfully generous people with their time and their experience, aren't they? Because they care about learning.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If they can
want to
say
leave
something,
the ladder down. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to talk about in there, and I spent a little bit of time coaching internally when I was doing my coach training, so I've had a little bit so again, I think so. I did my coach training through the apprentice levy, which is a wonderful way to become qualified, because obviously your organisation recognises that it's an important qualification to have, so supports you. The government money needs to be used anyway by organisations, so they're sort of getting their money's worth out of this pot, but it also means that you can pay it forward within the organisation by coaching internally to get your hours in.
Yes.
So again, it's a very interesting way. And then a lot of the people that I was training with were doing that as part of internal coaching pools. So they would become sort of normally as a bolt on to their kind of primary job, they would coach a certain number of hours internally as well. But yeah, I think that's a relatively new thing en masse. I'm sure there were organisations that did do it, but seems to be much more commonplace now.
It really is. Actually, so I've got a whole section now in the training chapter about the apprenticeship scheme because I think it's been absolutely brilliant.
Oh, it's fantastic.
And I've got one case study actually on someone of her experience of using the apprenticeship scheme. And I think it's absolutely terrific because it's just another pot of money that wasn't really available before, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great way to...
big... Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, absolutely. Well, I think we're about to say the same thing. It's only larger organisations that can take advantage of it.
Exactly.
But it's an expensive qualification to self-fund. So it removes that barrier to entry for some people who are amazing coaches.
I agree. I think it's absolutely terrific. And of course, the other aspect of having a co-author is that, we needed to coordinate.
Yes.
So I had this lovely weekend in Beaulieu 2024, and she came and stayed with me, and we did another one about 3 or 4 months later in Dulwich. We had sort of regular check-ins. I should think we had a Zoom about once a fortnight to see how we were doing. We sort of set each other deadlines. We sent each other material. It was quite interesting because at the beginning I thought, how are we going to run this? And my brother-in-law happened to have written quite a few books with a colleague, and so I had lunch with him and said, so how do you do it? And the first thing he said was, well, you have to establish some ground rules, and the first one is that you're in charge. So I said, okay. And he said it's not just a control thing; it's simply that the buck has to stop with someone.
Someone has to make the decision.
Yeah. And there's something about voice as well, because obviously the first edition was all my voice. And, it was important that we continued to have a voice that was, there was some continuity of voice throughout the book, as it were.
Absolutely.
And Julia, immediately said, absolutely no problem with that at all. So that was lovely. But it was great to have accountability. I work well to deadlines, but I also work well to saying to somebody, I'm going to do something by so whenever, because then, I'm conscientious. And therefore, so though I'm easily distracted, I'm also conscientious. So it turns out, so I might well, and often am, a last minute merchant, but I don't actually miss deadlines. Yes, I'm very, very deadline driven. So it's been quite a different experience second time round.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I really appreciate the fact that you've pointed out around the tone of voice as well. Because as you say, when you are working collaboratively, there is sometimes, different authors do it in different ways, don't they? Sometimes they'll do like one chapter in one voice and one chapter in another. A kind of amalgam will be created of the two. But in your situation, your reader expectation is that the book is an updated version of the book they've already enjoyed predominantly. So how are you meeting those reader expectations? So it's a really, really sensible decision to make right at the outset. Completely agree.
And the other thing was, though, that we didn't know at the beginning how much work it was going to involve. And I think that the sort of the thing that came as a big surprise was simply how much there was, because once we talked to people about how the landscape had changed, there were so many things around, obviously, the impact of COVID on, now there's so much virtual coaching rather than coaching face-to-face. There's the impact of COVID in terms of the sorts of issues that are being brought to internal coaches by employees, around mental health and wellness and anxiety and loneliness because of working remotely and, all that sort of stuff. But there's also loads of things that have moved on, like, using tech in coaching, team coaching. Internal coaches didn't really do any team coaching when I did the first edition, or if they did, very, very few of them, whereas now a lot of internal coaches do team coaching. There's a lot more around sort of three-way contracting than there was. it feels as if a lot of things have moved on one way and another. And so one of the things we did have to do is to have a conversation with Routledge around how much longer the book could be, because the first edition was 100,000 words.
Gosh.
And we've got all this massive new material. And so we had the conversation. They said, well, we can give you a maximum of 10% more. So that's 110,000 words. And I reckon we had maybe 30 to 40,000 words worth of new material. So the amount of cutting I had to do with this edition was massive. And I'm sure you know Paul Herdman from the EMCC.
I do.
So Paul's very kindly, Paul every year does a sort of 10 best coaching books of the year. And he's recently put on LinkedIn his 10 best books, and very kindly has included internal coaching, the inside story. But what he put in there, one of the things he said was words to the effect of there's so much new material in the second edition, it's like a new book.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I was so thrilled that he'd noticed, because I had someone a couple of weeks ago who said, oh, you're doing a second edition, so you're just doing a few tweaks. And I thought, oh, God, I wish
no idea.
A few tweaks, so isn't a few tweaks. But so it has been, it's been a big project.
It's been a labour of love from the sound of it. And I always ask guests, once they have talked about the book that they've published, whether they intend to write another one. And from one labour of love to another labour of love. Tell me a little bit more about what your next project is.
Indeed. So when the whole thing arose of my possibly doing a second edition, so that's back in autumn of 2023, I was at the stage of I had started submitting to agents a thriller that I had written where the protagonist is a coach. And the reason that the germ of why I wanted to write a thriller in the first place, apart from the fact I love reading thrillers, is that when I was doing my original research for the first coaching book on ethical dilemmas, I thought, what fun it would be to write a book about a coach who actually doesn't deal with ethical dilemmas at all well. So the first in the series, she's coaching government minister, because I had 20 years as a senior civil servant. So obviously it meant I could combine the sort of ministerial experience with my coaching experience. And so it was massively fun. And I was very lucky to be on a long list for the Cheshire Novel Prize. And the sort of reward for being on the long list was you got 2 full pages of detailed feedback, which was like gold dust, And it was, when I read it, I thought, oh gosh, this is great. I'm going to stop submitting to agents until I've implemented all this feedback, because it was so helpful. And then that's when the Routledge thing began. So the fiction has been on the back burner for 2.25 years, and I can't wait to get back to it. So that's the next project. In January, I'm going to start doing my next lot of edits on the first in the series. I've done the first draft of the second in the series as well, but that's a long way off now. And then I get going and start submitting to agents, because I would absolutely love to publish fiction. I've had such a ball with it.
It's so funny, isn't it? Because I know when we first met, I did it the other way round. I wrote mystery first and then wrote non-fiction second. So I've often said fiction for fun, because I too have my next fiction book drafted, ready to go as soon as my next non-fiction is out.
There you go. Well, great. Well, but perhaps we should be sort of holding each other to account on our fiction when we get back to that.
For sure. I actually think our characters should have cameos in each other's books. That would be quite fun.
Oh, wouldn't that be fun? I used to be
cross-world stuff.
Yes, which would be absolutely great. And actually, something else that I'd forgotten about in the other thing that's really changed. Sorry, it's jumping back, but I know we're nearly finishing.
Oh, no, it's all right.
For the second edition, there is so much now, much more around EDI and neurodiversity. So our whole new chapter has got has got quite a lot now on working with clients with neurodiversity, and also actually the importance in your coaching pool of having a more neurodiverse coaching pool. Well, not just neurodiverse, but diverse from all sorts of points of view, because that's a real issue for many organisations. They may want their pools to be more diverse, but actually making that happen can be quite difficult. And you're stuck with a load of middle-class, middle-aged white females like me, you know. That's not really what you want.
No, it's a really, really important point. And again, it links to that return on investment piece as well, didn't it, that you touched on earlier, where I often find with large corporates, they have very well-meaning inclusivity initiatives, well-being initiatives, coaching initiatives. And as soon as times get tight, those are the things that get cut first. So having the blend of people that is supporting your whole workforce in a way that's measurable financially as well as with your other metrics is so vitally important to keep those services on the table. Yes, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I absolutely love your podcast. So I've listened to quite a few episodes, and I've noticed that you sometimes ask people about, you know, what's the myth they'd like to dispel.
Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to say that there is a myth about, you know, internal coaches, and that internal coaches are sort of the poor relation and sort of inferior in some way to external coaches. And I just talk to so many internal coaches now, and it's just the most annoying myth, because they swim in a much more complicated set of waters than external coaches do. They really do. They have to navigate all sorts of ethical challenges and so on. And many of them are, you know, there's just the same kind of U-curve, if you like, of distribution for internal coaches as for external coaches in terms of experience. You know, there are a lot of internal coaches who've been coaching for 20 years, you know, within their organisations. And sure, there'll be new ones, and, you know, there'll be a lot in the middle, but just like with external coaches. So the fact that one is an internal coach does not mean that one necessarily is less experienced than someone who is an external coach at all. And it always annoys me whenever I come across this particular myth, because I think internal coaches are quite amazing. You have to be a special person to coach on top of your day job, you know, because they often have very busy day jobs as well.
Oh, and there's so much we could go into there, but I'm really conscious I've used up all your time already. And around boundaries, I'm like, we need to talk about the boundaries, how they maintain the boundaries. But anyway, Katharine, thank you. I could literally talk to you all day. That has been fascinating. Please, can we close by, can you share with listeners where the best place is for them to find you and your book online?
Well, for me, LinkedIn is where I'm pretty active. So Katharine St John-Brooks, and I think I'm the only Katharine St John-Brooks on LinkedIn. Not quite easy to find me there. And Routledge, obviously, Routledge and Waterstones and Amazon, and the book is there. I mean, we've had a ball writing it, and I hope people enjoy reading it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll pop the links for those in the show notes so people can find you nice and easily. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Helen, really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Katharine. We had such a giggle recording that episode. Next time, I'm joined by Claire Turner, and we're going to be talking all about her book, Abundance Alchemy. I'll see you for the next chapter. Thank you for joining me today. You can get the show notes and your free guide to publishing options at coachwrite.co.uk. Remember to subscribe and leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. Your words can make a difference. A review can too. If you'd like to connect, find me on LinkedIn, O'Neill Helen, that's O'Neill, ONEILL, or on Instagram at coach_right. I'll see you for the next chapter of Coach Right.